Hello everyone, and welcome to our workshop on supporting our children with eating difficulties. My name is Sarah St Ledger, and I'm a psychologist working in the Psychology in Schools team, which is part of the local mental health trust, the Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust, or NSFT. And I'm joined today by my colleague Zoe. And Zoe, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name's Zoe. I'm an assistant psychologist in the Psychology in Schools team of Sarah, and I'll let my colleague Kathy introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Kathy Jackson. I'm the principal clinical psychologist for the Suffolk Children, Family and Young Person ARFID service, which is currently under development.
Lovely. Thanks, guys. Um, so we've just got some kind of introductory questions for you. So if you could use Slido, we were just curious to know what the age of your child or children is. Okay, so not so many littlies. Okay, so sort of 10 and upwards. Brilliant. And we wondered what the gender of your child was. Okay, thank you. And then we were curious to know how you would rate your knowledge of eating difficulties. And this is something that we will come back to at the end of today's workshop to see if there's been any change. Okay, so lots of middle of the road. Okay. Varied audience in the room. And then how would you rate your confidence in supporting children and young people with eating difficulties? Okay, not many people at the top of the end. I take it, Zoe, that one is um, not very confident and 10 is very confident. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. So just an overview of today's workshop then. So we're going to be thinking about how to understand childhood eating difficulties, and then we're going to move on to thinking about a little bit about how we can help our children with eating and eating difficulties. And we're also going to be thinking a little bit about when we might need to seek specialist support and help with this. And I think it's worth sort of saying that today is quite a broad session, and we know that eating difficulties can happen for many number of reasons. And the support that children and young people will need will, of course, vary. So today is very much an introduction to some of the ideas around eating difficulties, with some signposting and additional resources at the end if you would like to seek some more support. So another Slido. So what is it that you are worried about with your child's eating? And this will really help to cue us in about what we might need to spend more time on during the presentation. So that it'll progress to something worse without me truly realizing. Yeah, that sounds really, it's not a nice thought to have as a parent, is it? Strategies to use. Limited diet, restrictive eating, okay. We're going to be thinking a little bit about strategies and things that might help in this sort of second part of the workshop this evening. Cutting out food, small portions. Yeah. Again, restrictive eating, worries about looking fat. And we're going to talk a little bit about body image. One is overeating and the other is undereating. Okay, that must be really tricky to manage if you've got siblings with very different eating habits or difficulties. They used to eat a wide variety and now not so much. So you might have noticed a change in eating habits. Okay. Thank you, everybody. That's really helpful. And again, how does this affect you as a family? Creates tension, yes, very common, I think. And we're going to talk a little bit about the impact on family. Anxiety, yep, can create a lot of anxiety when our children and young people are having some difficulties with their eating. Again, anxiety. Any other impacts on the family? Okay, thanks everybody. That's really helpful. So we're just going to start by thinking a little bit about the prevalence of eating difficulties. And there's a rather large study called the Mental Health of Children and Young People UK survey. And this survey happens every few years and it asks about various different mental health and well-being problems. And the most recent survey, which was completed in, I think, 2022, indicated that among 11 to 16-year-olds, the number or percentage of young people whose responses indicated possible eating difficulties, so not an eating disorder, but possible eating difficulties, was 8.1% of boys and 17.8% of girls. So among 17 to 19-year-olds, this rose to 45.5% of boys and 75.9% of girls. So the majority of girls and almost half of boys in the 17 to 19-year-old bracket had possible eating difficulties. So really high number there. We also have selective eating. So this is another presentation of eating, which might include being quite selective, quite picky with what sort of foods a child or young person might want to eat. And the prevalence of this, we think, is around 10 to 15%, or around 1 in 10 children between the ages of 2 to 5. So for younger children, selective eating is quite common. And what we generally see is as they get older, children will grow out of this, but obviously in some cases this can persist. And from existing research evidence, it's hard to sort of come to firm conclusions about the prevalence of eating disorders in children and young people in the UK. But generally, for each type of eating disorder, it's around 1% of children and young people. So eating disorders are much less common than selective eating or eating difficulties more generally. And we can see how eating difficulties, particularly in the 17 to 19 group, are quite common, and selective eating is also fairly common for younger children, with eating disorders less common. And we'll be talking about eating difficulties today. So we're not going to go into eating disorders during this workshop. we're keeping it much more broad. If you could do the next slide. Thanks, Zoe. So you might have already heard of the iceberg idea, but what we're showing here with this iceberg metaphor is that what we see and hear in a child in their eating behavior is only a small part of the story. So some of the behaviours we might see at the tip of the iceberg. So, for example, things like distress at meal times, refusing food, maybe not eating enough, or maybe eating too much. Um, that they're what we might see on the surface. But the reasons sort of underlying those things that we see on the surface can be really varied, and it can be quite hard to work out for some young people. And to really sort of understand and know how to help a young person with their eating, we really need to know about what's going on under the iceberg. So, under the surface, there could be lots of things going on, some of which we'll cover today. So, we're going to be thinking a little bit about early childhood experiences, a little bit about biology, body image, struggling with some emotions and lack of control. And we're going to spend the sort of first part of the workshop talking in a little more detail about some of these things. And then in the second half of the workshop, we'll be focusing a bit more on what we might be able to do to help our young people with their eating difficulties. So, starting with biology and early childhood. So, we do know that for some young people, there can be something in their biology, so something inherent to them, that can make appetite control and regulation of food intake, like the signals you get if you're hungry or full, more difficult. And this, of course, is quite a complex thing to unpick and to understand. We also know that hormones can impact on this too, and there are many hormones in the brain and the body signaling hunger and satiety, so how full we are. And so changes in these hormones, such as during puberty, can impact on these processes, which can in turn impact eating. And there's also an important role of something that we call interoception, which is a sense of how our body feels on the inside. It's part of our sensory system. And so for some young people with sensory sensitivities or neurodivergent young people, that understanding of what our body feels like on the inside might be much more difficult. And that might mean it's difficult for those children to recognize certain feelings like hunger or fullness. As well as biology and innate things, there's also a potential impact of early childhood. So typically, when children are babies, they're eating a limited number of foods, so often starting with just milk. And over time, as they get older, they try new foods and they learn to tolerate and enjoy new textures, smells, and tastes. And typically, by the age of 5, most children are able to eat and enjoy a wide range of food. However, for some young people, there can be disruptions to normal feeding development, perhaps creating anxiety or avoidance of certain foods. And some things we know that can impact that are any sort of significant illnesses or hospitalizations in the early years. We know that medical interventions such as surgery, particularly gastrosurgery, can impact on typical feeding development. Sometimes developmental delay or sensory issues can make that sort of typical feeding development quite tricky for some young people and can mean that they're not able to enjoy a broad range of food and textures. We know that sometimes allergies and intolerances can also play a part too. And if children are unable to eat a range of foods or certain food groups, or they have a particular response to a certain food, they might understandably feel quite anxious about trying new things because they don't want to feel or become unwell. So lots of things in sort of early childhood that can play a role in why someone might develop an eating difficulty. So moving on, we're going to think a little bit about body image concerns. And this is quite a common one that sort of people think of when we talk about eating difficulties in young people. And for the purpose of today's workshop, when we say body image concerns, we're talking about the negatively biased views of someone's own sort of body image, which impacts on how they eat. So whether that's with the intention of losing weight, of gaining weight, or changing the way that they look based on a negative view of themselves. Um, and we know that there's a big role of social media for young people, and that exposure to what we think of as the ideal body image um, can usually be quite unattainable. And there's not much awareness of things like editing that goes on with this social media post that people see, and also what unhealthy decisions that person might be making to look a certain way. And within this, there's often misinformation about food and diets. And of course, we know that adolescents are very interested in what their peers and others are doing. So if they're hearing this information, it can be really difficult for them to filter through that. Something else we know really has a big influence is our culture, and it really influences sort of what we think of as an ideal. So, for example, previously in Western culture in the early sort of 2000s, the ideal for um, women was to be very thin, gaunt looking, supermodel appearance. That was very popular, but now it's very popular to have an hourglass figure. So the culture at the time in society really has an influence on our sort of body image ideals. And there was one really interesting study looking at teenage girls in Fiji, and it was before Western TV had been introduced to Fiji, and they did a study of a small rural community of the teenage girls living in that community. And after the introduction of TV to that community, there was a sharp increase in girls developing eating disorders. So we know that the media we consume really does influence our body image. Um, we know that peers are really influential too, especially as our young people enter into adolescence. And sadly, we know that some young people can be subject to bullying, and obviously, this can really have a negative impact on the way a young person views themselves and their body image. Um, we know that around adolescence, our bodies are changing and they're changing shapes. And sometimes that can be confusing or unexpected or uncomfortable for young people. And this can lead to some of the concerns around wanting to change their body image. And we just wanted to say that we know it's very much a problem for girls and boys. I think eating sort of difficulties are more commonly thought of in girls, but absolutely boys can have body image concerns, and this can sometimes look quite different. So, for example, someone with body image concerns might do lots of body building and weightlifting, trying to look a certain way, and there, although it sort of it looks different, it can be equally as damaging and unhealthy, sort of trying to obtain those unobtainable body shapes, and it can lead to eating difficulties. So we've got another Slido here. So what is challenging about meal times in your family? It would be really good to know what some of the challenges are. Is there anything that you struggle with around meal times? I know sometimes all eating together at the table can be a bit of a challenge. Oh, agreement on what to eat and how much. Yeah, really tricky. Trying to find something that everyone wants to eat. Again, really tricky, and you can often end up cooking multiple things to try and please everybody. They've eaten it before, why won't they eat it now? Yeah, sometimes they go through phases, don't they, of eating um one thing and then they eat it so much and then they don't want it anymore. That can be quite frustrating, I guess, when they've eaten something and then they suddenly don't want it. Claiming they're not hungry or hate what we've made causes arguments. Yeah, yeah, really tricky. Limited food choices again and meals they will eat. Not wanting to eat with the family, not wanting to sit down and eat. That can feel really tricky, can't it? Because I think we've all got sort of we're all given messages as, that it's good to sit down and eat together as a family and that mealtime should be a social time. And it's when you're meant to sort of catch up about the day. And it can put quite a lot of pressure, can't it, if your young person doesn't want to do that or they feel uncomfortable with that. Um, Arguments and negativity at meal times. Yeah, really, really difficult stuff there that you're all dealing with. Thank you so much for sharing, everybody. So, you've talked a little bit there about the impact of your young person's eating difficulties on the family. Um, and we touched a bit about that at the beginning. So, it could be in terms of the impact on siblings. So, when one sibling is struggling with food, or like you were just saying, you have to cook different meals for different people, and that can be really time consuming and expensive. It might be that you'd all like to eat together at the table, but that's really difficult. So there are lots and lots of potential impacts of eating difficulties on the family. But I guess what we wanted to recognize here is that for our young people, the family and their relationship situations around them, whether that's friendships or things like that, can also have a big impact on food and eating. So, for example, family and friends' narratives and traditions around food can have an impact on our young people. So, if a family's tradition is to celebrate holidays or occasions with big family meals or eating a lot of food, and a child doesn't like that or finds it overwhelming, they might start to fear food or try to avoid it. Um, there might also be narratives around finishing what's on your plate, or you can't leave the table until everyone is finished, which might feel quite overwhelming for some children. Um, and this might come from other family members, or it might be something that you, as parents or carers, could have experienced yourself in childhood. I know when I was growing up, it was quite a big thing that you had to finish everything on your plate. And I know that that sort of sticks with you a bit, and it can cause some difficulties when you get older. Um, yeah, that so these things can cause lots of pressure for you and your young person, especially when you're around maybe other family members that have these sort of values and ideas around eating. We also know that if a parent has an eating disorder, then a child is more likely to struggle with one too. And this is absolutely not about blaming, but it's just, I guess, understanding that if a parent has some avoidance or some fear around food, this can then become a learnt behavior in the young person, and they can have some of the same worries or similar experiences around food. And we know that genes also play a little bit of a role too. Um, Obviously, when children get into their teenage years, they're trying to balance being more autonomous, but there's still that pull towards dependence on family to be fed, to be provided meals at meal times. And if they're struggling with food, this can be really difficult for parents. as there's a biological drive as a parent to feed our children right from when they're tiny babies. So our biological goal is to ensure that our children survive and thrive, and eating is often a really essential part of that. So it can be incredibly stressful as parents when your child is having some eating difficulties. So, sense of control is also something that can be related to eating difficulties for young people. So, in the iceberg idea that we looked at in the beginning, there were many emotions which might underlie what we see on the surface. So, if a young person is feeling anxious or self conscious or sad, or when the world feels out of control or is anxiety provoking, a young person might try and establish a sense of control wherever they can in their lives. And this might be through undereating or overeating or maybe exercising excessively. Um, and we do have, just to mention, we do have some specific workshops on anxiety and low mood, as well as other mental health topics, which we will signpost you to the end of this work. We'll signpost you to at the end of this workshop. And if you think that some of these mental health difficulties might be playing a role for your young person in their eating, then we'd really encourage you to look at those workshops as well. And I'm just going to pass you over to Kathy now, who's going to talk you through a bit about communicating a need.
Hi everyone. I will do my level best to get through this without coughing too much because I'm recovering from a nasty cold. Um, so we've already sort of begun to touch on this subject, but eating habits may also be a way for a child to non-verbally communicate a need. And this is often particularly the case in children, young people who struggle to effectively verbalize their needs. So have got some kind of difficulty in using words and language to share with us how they're feeling. Um, as Sarah's just touched on, food and eating is a very kind of emotive, very anxiety provoking topic for us as parents. And it therefore is a very powerful way for any of us to signal that we might perhaps be struggling with something or have a need of some kind. Um, so I guess we can see eating behaviors as sort of one of the most effective ways of waving a red flag, letting us know that something is off. Because by not eating or eating in an unusual or challenging way, our children and young people can let us know that there's a need to be concerned. There's something to be worried about here. So we've given you a few examples on this slide here of how eating behaviours might be used as a form of communication. And this is it's important to add that when we say communication, we don't necessarily always mean at a conscious level. This might be that unconsciously a young person or child has come to realize that when they don't eat or when they don't eat well, that we're more anxious or more concerned or more kind of in tune with them. And therefore it can kind of become reinforced. So not eating or eating in a disordered way might be a way of communicating distress that we find it hard to put into words. It might also be a way of regulating strong feelings. And I'm sure lots of us can kind of think of times when we've eaten certain foods in response to feeling a certain way. So, for example, comfort foods that make us feel soothed. That's a really common example of kind of an eating behavior serving the function of regulating our feelings. Equally, we might be able to think of times when our appetite has changed due to stress or grief. So again, we can see how kind of our feelings, our emotional world is linked to our eating and our appetite. Um, Sometimes not eating can be a way of trying to activate feelings of being safe and shielded from demands and expectations. And this might be particularly the case where not eating or eating in a restricted way leads us to become more unwell, um, and then shielded from sort of some of the demands and expectations that the world places on all of us. We've already mentioned about accessing feelings of control, which is very powerfully done often through not eating or eating in a disordered way. Sometimes people may also experience a sort of bolstering of their self-esteem through restricted eating or eating in a particular way. At the moment, there's sort of lots of discussion around kind of what it means to be healthy on social media. And for example, if we follow those rules, it might make us feel good. And if we're not feeling good in other domains of our life, that can be very powerful. Alternatively, some ways of eating might mirror negative things that we feel about ourselves. So, for example, if we feel unworthy or undeserving, we may feel that we're unworthy or undeserving of food, or only deserving of certain types of food that are perhaps less nourishing. This sort of links to the one we were just talking about. So eating or not eating can be a form of communication, and therefore eating or eating in a disordered way can also impact on the behaviours of others around us. Um, Here we're considering that it, in a family unit where meal times are shared, that any changes in eating behaviour are particularly noticeable and particularly concerning. So, therefore, eating difficulties often have the effect inadvertently of drawing caregivers closest. And as Sarah's already mentioned, that links very closely to our evolutionary drive to nourish our young. Um, it's one of the first forms of contact we have as caregivers. So, that urge to feed and draw closer can heighten when eating difficulties are present as we try to fix that perceived problem. Um, so we're not suggesting in any way that families or children or young people are doing this on purpose to manipulate one another. That's a really common misconception that gets sort of bandied around, that my child's doing this to manipulate me, to draw me closer deliberately. It's much more likely that this is an unconscious process of learning and behavior. So we're just moving away from some of that kind of more emotion related food behaviors onto thinking more about some of the work that my team is now doing around features of something called ARFID, so avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So not everybody that has these qualities or experiences these difficulties has ARFID, but some of these are features of ARFID. Um, so some people, some children, some young people, some adults simply lack interest in food and eating, which for those of us that are very interested in food and eating can feel really difficult to fathom. Sometimes that's related to distractibility. Other times that can be related to high arousal, so a focus on other things that are going on around us. Poor interoceptive awareness means a low awareness or low connection to what's going on inside our bodies. So some people are less aware of their hunger and fullness signals than others. And some people simply have a lower hunger drive, and that can be biologically driven. There's lots of kind of studies being done at the moment that examine levels of things like hormones and chemicals in the brain that communicate with our gut and help us to be aware of how hungry we are. It can also be down to things like our environment. So, for example, if we grow up in an environment where there isn't much food, our bodies tend to adapt to that environment and get used to living without much food. Sensory characteristics of food can also be another reason that why some people may find certain foods more challenging to eat. And there are a whole range of aspects of food's appearance, texture, smell, etc., that may impact on how tolerable and palatable it is to any individual child or young person. We've given some examples there. Temperature, some children find it really hard to tolerate foods that are too warm, others too cold. Taste is obviously, there's a huge range of tastes, and some of us find, for example, bitterness very hard to tolerate. Other people find things that are very, very sweet really difficult to tolerate. The appearance of foods can be challenging, particularly in our neurodiverse children and young people. Um, that sort of regularity of the appearance of food can become very important. So, foods that can look or taste different on different presentations can be particularly challenging. If I take an example, um, a piece of pasta, as you can see there, could be al dente, as in quite crispy still, or it could be completely soggy. And the fact that you don't know and can't predict that can be really difficult for some people. Other foods, like packaged foods, tend to be much more routine and present the same every time, which is why they're often more tolerable to some people. Textures, certain textures can be very challenging. Again, that's really different individual to individual. And that brand specificity can arise out of that desire to access foods that feel safe, that we know how they're going to taste, what the texture is going to be like, etc. Um, it mentions there about the aversive kind of response to oral surprise. So that's something we see that as developmentally normal in young children, but can perpetuate into later childhood for some children who struggle with unpredictability. A slider again here, and this kind of relates to what we're talking about here. So, out of interest, how much would you each have to be paid to eat a tarantula? I promise that the rationale for asking this question will become clear. Okay, someone says I wouldn't. So, for no amount of money, anyone else? Okay, so somebody's saying if it was already dead, maybe £10,000. So it seems like I'm guessing the fairly consensus view is that it would need to be quite a lot of money, and some people there is no amount of money that would have you do this. And that links to what we're talking about here today, because for some children, trying new foods or trying foods that they generally avoid can feel like eating a tarantula, like being on an I'm a Celebrity trial. Their aversion, their distress, their disgust when they come across certain foods, particularly novel ones that are new to them, is such that for them it is akin to being asked to eat a tarantula. So we can see why it's such a huge ask when we try to work with them on expanding their range of foods. Finally, we can also sometimes find ourselves avoiding foods or avoiding certain types of food due to concern or anxiety about the consequences of eating them. Often, this follows some kind of traumatic incident involving food and eating. And it may be that only the food that, for example, was choked upon or caused an episode of vomiting is avoided, but sometimes over time that can start to generalize out. So if we choked on meat, it can start as I can't eat meat, and then I can't eat any textures that are like meat, and then I can't eat anything that smells like it. And over time, it can gradually start to broaden out such that it impacts on our diet more broadly. Food neophobia is basically fear of novelty, and that can certainly be part of the picture. Um, once we've developed a kind of a fear around a certain food, that any foods where there's that unpredictable element, it becomes much more likely that we would avoid them. Again, neophobia is developmentally normal in children between 2 and 5-ish, slightly older if there is any degree of developmental delay, but can perpetuate into older childhood for some children and young people. Okay, I'm handing over to Zoe, I believe.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing that with us. So now we're going to think a little bit together about what are some of the things that you can do as a parent or carer to support your young person with their eating difficulties that you've shared with us today. So we're going to think about this a little bit in terms of good habits and prevention. We're going to think a little bit about developing a shared understanding with your young person of their eating difficulties. We're going to think a little bit about managing at meal times. We're going to think about some possible red flags for eating disorders that you may look out for in your young person. And we're also going to think about some resources that we'll share with you on seeking further help. And these resources will be sent to you in a follow-up email if you've registered for them to be sent to you as well. But we really want to acknowledge at this point that kind of what works for you as a family will be different to the next family. You know, every child is unique, and it's about kind of finding things that feel helpful for you and your young person, and kind of you as the parent and carer knowing your young person best and kind of getting to know what they find helpful. So kind of this is just some advice and guidance. Don't feel that all these strategies will necessarily work for you. It's about finding what does work for you. So we're going to start off with a little Slido question here. So we're wondering, what have you found helpful in supporting your child's eating difficulties? So we're wondering, perhaps you might have already tried some things at home at meal times that your young person has found helpful and that you might like to share with us today. So I'll just give you a moment to join on to that and to type in your responses. If you've not joined onto it already, you can join just by scanning the QR code on the left with your camera. Drawing for control and eating at the same time. Okay, so kind of using that distraction there has been really helpful for your young person. Thank you. I wonder if anyone else has found any strategies helpful or have their own cupboard. That's nice. So kind of having their cupboard of foods that they know belong to them. Thank you. And it might be that you're feeling a little bit stuck. It might be that you kind of feel like you've tried lots of different things and they're not working for your young person. And that can feel really frustrating. Positive goals and knowledge of consequences of not eating well. Yeah, so kind of educating about kind of the importance of nutrition and having kind of that positive language is really helpful and something we're going to think about a little bit together as well. Okay, thank you for sharing those. So, we're going to think now together a little bit about good habits and prevention, as we said. So, I really want to acknowledge, kind of, first of all, that it can be really tricky managing some of the challenges that you've brought today as a parent and carer. You know, you want your young person to be healthy, you've got that biological drive to feed your child, and kind of it can feel really frustrating sometimes as a parent or carer when we're seeing some of these eating difficulties, or it can feel quite emotional. So we really want to highlight the importance of prioritizing your own well-being, okay? I think as a parent or carer, this is often sort of the first thing that we let go of a little bit when supporting young people. And it's all about making sure you're looking after yourself first. That aeroplane analogy. So kind of putting on your own oxygen mask before you're able to put on someone else's. So we just really want to acknowledge that seeking help and support for yourself if needed is really, really important. You don't need to kind of do this alone. It's okay to ask for help. And hopefully you've seen from some of the Slidos today that a lot of your experiences are shared of other parents and carers, and it can be really helpful to kind of talk about those as well. So it's really important to prioritize your well-being. We've also put here prioritizing family meal times for food and conversation. So kind of having structured routines around meal times and making these an opportunity for socialization can be helpful for some young people. Okay, so for some young people, the more we make those meal times feel predictable and safe, this will support them to be more manageable for that young person. But when we're thinking about kind of the broad range of eating difficulties that we might see in young people, again, it's really important to hold in mind what works for you. So, whilst we recommend this, do think about your child. You might have tried this and it doesn't work for you. For example, perhaps your child has a sensory sensitivity, and this might feel really overwhelming for your young person having those family meal times. So, it's about finding what works for you. We've also got modeling balance and kind of having that awareness of your own use of language and your own behaviour around food. So, young people really pick up on the way we talk about food and our behaviour around food. So, as parents and carers, it's really helpful to be aware of the language that you're using to talk about food. We live in a culture where talking about food in unhelpful ways, and kind of that diet culture language has become really, really normalized and really common. For example, you might hear labeling of certain foods as naughty or bad, or you might have heard somebody say, "Oh, I can't have that. I'm being good today." And I think it's something that we do tend to hear a lot around this time of year as well. So it might be language you're noticing around Christmas time. Um, and often we have good intentions when using this language, but we need to kind of be mindful of what does this language actually tell us about food and how this use of language can almost demonize certain foods and label them as bad to our young people. So it's something to hold in mind. And language is free for those who are verbal. So we can also use language positively as well. So, for example, when a child tries something new, despite having sensory sensitivities, praise can be used and is really so important for our children. For example, your young person may struggle to tolerate new foods, or certain foods may feel uncomfortable for them. So, by praising them on what they have achieved and focusing less on what they haven't eaten, can be really helpful for young people. Um, and it's all about kind of validating that you can see what they're doing and you can see how they're trying, which is key. So, using language that focuses on the positives, on bravery and praise, can really help young people to thrive. Um, but in addition to being mindful of your language, it's not just all about what you say, it's also helpful to think about what you do as well. So, for example, maybe your young person always sees you eating the same kind of food. Your young person will likely notice this. And this is absolutely not to say that as adults we cannot diet or we cannot eat these foods if we want to. It's about, again, just being mindful about how you might choose to manage this in front of your young person and being mindful of how young people may pick up on this behaviour. Okay, so now we're going to think a little bit about shared understanding. So it can be really helpful to develop a shared understanding of eating difficulties with your young person. And this is really all about having those opportunities to connect with your young person and showing a little bit of curiosity as to what might be going on beneath the surface for your young person. Kind of reflecting back to what Sarah shared with us earlier when we looked at that iceberg image and just thinking that what we see on the surface is just the tip, isn't it? About what's really going on um, for that young person. There are so many different causes, and sometimes it can be easy to assume that we know the reason and what might be going on for the child based on what we see. But this is really all about encouraging you to be curious and to be mindful that we don't always know what's going on for a child, and not to make assumptions about what might be going on behind your child's difficulties. Sometimes the emotions behind eating difficulties can feel really, really tricky to talk about as well. And we might almost want to avoid thinking about these together with our young person or talking about them. So, kind of when thinking about building this shared understanding, for older children, which a lot of people said they had older children today, this will likely look like having a conversation with them. So thinking together about what's difficult about meal times, what feels helpful for your young person, what doesn't feel helpful for your young person, so that you can kind of hold these in mind. It's really, really important to have this conversation at the right time. And we've used the statement there, strike when the iron is cold. So it's thinking about when is the right time to have this discussion. So if eating difficulties, it's not likely to be around meal times. These are generally not a good time to kind of have these discussions of building that shared understanding about the eating difficulties together. So not before or after or during meal times. We're kind of thinking about when emotions are high already. So when emotions are heightened, kind of that thinking part of the brain is basically offline. It's not engaging in the same way. So young people aren't going to be able to kind of think about what would be helpful for them and what's difficult for them and share that with you. So it can be really helpful to kind of have these conversations. Um, when it's a low pressure and a calm environment for you both. When thinking about kind of younger children as well, I think it's going to be kind of maybe less about having a conversation, but more about holding that iceberg in mind and kind of thinking and noticing what might be going on for that young person. So yeah, it's kind of just about thinking together, really. It's really important that you try and capture your young person's views in this. You can make suggestions, but it's really about kind of thinking together. And thinking together can kind of support you in not getting things wrong or kind of making assumptions. Can also be really helpful to consider your non-negotiables in advance, okay? So you need to be realistic with your young person about where you're coming from with that conversation that you're having. So what are you willing to accept? What are you not willing to accept? And kind of explaining this to your young person and establishing those non-negotiables. So, for example, a non-negotiable might be explaining the importance of nutrition for your young person. So developing this shared understanding really is kind of that first step and thinking about how to move forward, and it gives you a really good foundation to build from. So it's kind of thinking about that connection with your young person as an intervention really, and not avoiding kind of talking about the emotions. Okay, managing meal times. So, you can use that shared understanding that you've built with your young person to consider together what might make meal times feel easier and more manageable. Are there any strategies your young person has said they find helpful that you may be able to incorporate? And we really want to acknowledge that advice around meal times will be different for different eating difficulties, and the intervention will vary depending on what's driving the eating behaviour. So, for example, perhaps your child struggles to pay attention to food or has a lack of interest in food. And kind of managing meal times may look like finding ways of making food and meal times more fun and more engaging for that young person, perhaps through messy play. If your child is refusing to eat or is not eating enough food, um, it can be really important to kind of establish those non-negotiables due to those physical health concerns and really emphasizing these for your young person. So, kind of having those boundaries in place. If your child is struggling with new foods, it can be helpful to kind of introduce new foods really slowly. Consider kind of sensory differences and different kinds of foods that might fit within their acceptable range. So this is kind of that idea that we call food chaining. So kind of trying foods which are similar. So starting with that preferred food and gradually changing just one aspect of that food at a time and introducing it to the child or the young person. So, for example, if your young person, a safe food for them might be a chip. You could change the shape of that chip initially to make it a little bit thinner or a little bit thicker than they're used to having. We have some more specific advice coming up as well on this. Again, it can be helpful to prioritize being together as a family at meal times, but again, this does depend on the needs of your young person, and it might be something that actually they've identified as unhelpful. So again, using your judgment and knowing your child. It's really helpful to create that calm environment at meal times and to avoid applying pressure on your young person. I always think of emotions as contagious, so having a safe and a calm space can create an environment that feels safe and calm for them, which can kind of enable children to feel more able to try new things. And lastly, it's thinking about keeping conversations neutral. Okay, so trying to avoid conversations about what they are and what they aren't eating. This can add pressure to the young person at meal times and just generally can be quite unhelpful. Um, can also use distractions as well, which one of you shared earlier as a helpful strategy that you found. So it might be that the young person finds it helpful to eat their food in front of a TV, just for example. I'm just going to pass back over to Kathy now. Um, and Kathy is going to think together a little bit with you about some of the different support styles.
Hi again, everyone. So this is some strategies and ideas taken from um, a certain model of working with loved ones of people with an eating disorder, but I think it's equally applicable to supporting people with eating difficulties of any kind. In fact, it's kind of applicable to supporting people with difficulties in general, but its evidence base is around supporting people who struggle with their eating. And the basic premise is that along the top, you can see three animals that represent different ways of supporting a loved one. And along the top, the axis that we're looking at is how much kind of control and direction is involved in our support. So if we take the rhino style of support is where we try to um, help our young person by taking control, offering direction, kind of, I guess the animal's the rhino with that idea that we thunder in and we try to kind of take control and lead and sometimes through reason, not always through kind of direct behavior, but sometimes through trying to kind of reason and uh, explain and sort of go into that very like intellectual way of trying to solve a problem. Um, that would be the kind of rhino style of support, which can quite often make people back off because they feel a bit over controlled. The kangaroo at the other end of the direction box is where we can sometimes try to support and help people in a way that becomes sort of quite micromanaging or takes all sense of kind of responsibility and accountability away from that person. Again, the animal analogy is the Joey in the pouch. So sort of I'm being looked after, taken care of, but in a way that means I don't actually need to kind of make change or take responsibility for this. In the middle, we've got our dolphin, which we would describe as our kind of aspirational animal in terms of styles of support. And this is where we've got a kind of balance between subtle direction and care. And obviously, we all need to feel cared for. We all need to be supported. So it sort of represents that kind of good enough place. And again, the dolphin is a chosen animal because, as per the picture, a dolphin may swim behind us, sometimes nudging us along gently. Sometimes it might be that it's swimming ahead, showing us the way. So, no direct kind of action, just leading by example. Sometimes it may be swimming alongside us, being encouraging, but allowing us to lead the swim. Um, the second half of this, and what you can see down the bottom, is around emotion. And we know that eating difficulties have a big emotional impact on families, but also emotion in families has a big impact on eating. And this is particularly thinking about as caregivers, how much emotion should we share and display with children and young people around their eating? Again, the jellyfish and the ostrich sort of represent two extremes, whereby the jellyfish is that very transparent emotional response. We've all been there when we get very frustrated, very upset, very anxious, and that's sort of very clear in what we're saying or how we're behaving, written all over our faces, even if we're trying to contain it. And it can feel quite sort of unsafe for people around us, for children. At the other end, we've got the ostrich, head buried in the sand, no explanation really needed there, where perhaps sometimes in our efforts to try to manage how we feel about something that's challenging, we bury our heads and try to kind of avoid it. And perhaps that might involve not talking about eating or sort of not engaging with the fact that this is something our child or young person's clearly struggling with. In the middle, again, we have some kind of aspirational animal. And in this case, it's the St. Bernard, the rescue dog who represents warmth, calmness, and compassion, but with a degree of boundaries. So, still aware of the need, as Zoe said earlier, to look after itself. And that emotion is part of life, that we can't avoid it and should talk about it, but that it's best to do so when the iron is cold, to use the analogy that was used earlier. So sometimes having emotional conversations separate to food when we know that food and eating is challenging is the best laid plan.
Thank you, Kathy, for sharing that. And I think it's really helpful to kind of think about when you might notice kind of falling into some of those different support styles and how that might change as well, depending on how you're feeling or what kind of day you might have been having. So thank you for that, Kathy. Um, so we wanted to share this website with you now. So this is a screenshot from an NHS website, which is really, really helpful for understanding children's eating and supporting kind of change in eating behaviour. And it's got a lot more kind of specific advice and guidance. So, for example, the importance of seating and positioning. The potential impact of autism on eating and drinking there we can see. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at this website, which you will of course get when you receive a copy of the slides and the resources following this workshop. It's got some really nice advice and lots of ideas and strategies that you might find helpful. We've also put a link in there to our childhood neurodiversity workshop on understanding and supporting eating difficulties. It might be that your child is neurodivergent, or you may suspect neurodiversity in your child, or you may just be interested to learn a little bit more about how eating difficulties may present differently in children who are neurodivergent. So we've got the link to that on the slide there as well, if you're interested in having a watch. Okay, so now we're going to think a little bit about what are some of the red flags that could indicate a young person may have an eating disorder. And I suppose we really want to highlight and acknowledge here that your young person may have some of these, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they have an eating disorder, okay? But it's about kind of using these as things that you might notice, some potential red flags that may kind of encourage you to be curious about what might be going on for your young person and to seek further support if it's needed, okay? So we've split these into kind of two categories here. So thinking about some of the physical signs that you might notice. So you might notice changes in weight. Specifically, these might be rapid changes. So these might happen quite quickly. It could be an increase or a decrease in weight. It could be that the weight is fluctuating. So this could be an indication of disordered eating. Feeling cold, feeling exhausted, feeling dizziness or feeling faint if a young person perhaps isn't having their nutritional needs met. You might start to notice that in faintness and dizziness. Periods becoming irregular, or they might stop completely if your child is in puberty. Nausea and vomiting as well. And dental problems as well, which can often be due to kind of not having those nutritional needs met, but can also be from vomiting if a young person has been making themselves sick, for example, from food. Then we've also got kind of emotional and behavioural signs that you might notice. So that preoccupation with the weight, with food, with dieting, those extreme concerns about their body image. You might notice them kind of checking their appearance in the mirror quite often. They might try on lots of different clothes in different sizes, kind of being really preoccupied with what their body looks like and how they feel about their body. It might be that excessive exercising or activity, kind of um, doing lots of walking, running to an excessive level. New rituals around food, so you might notice kind of weighing food or tearing food into small pieces, moving it around. Changes in diet, so cutting out food groups and switching to more low-calorie foods can be an indication. Wanting to eat alone and avoiding eating with others, so kind of a bit of secrecy around the eating behaviour can be an indication that something might be going on for your young person. Skipping meals, going to the toilet right after meals, missing food or discarded wrappers. So you might notice food disappearing from the cupboards without kind of any explanation or not knowing what's happened to that food. Or it might be kind of controlling or anxious at mealtime. So that sense of control that we spoke about earlier. So these are just some signs that your young person could be experiencing an eating disorder. And we share some information at the end about what to do if you're worried about your young person. So we're going to come on to this now. So um, trying to talk to your child about their problems, as we've said, if you're worried, being curious about any changes you might have noticed for your young person. The Beat website is really helpful for information about this, which is included in our resource pack, and it's got some advice and guidance on how to have conversations when you're worried about your young person, because we do acknowledge that this can be a really difficult conversation to have for many reasons. You might be worried about saying the wrong thing, you might be worried about making things worse. The young person might feel embarrassed, they may not feel that their eating is a problem, they might not recognize it, they might be defensive, they might deny that there's a problem. There might kind of be that secrecy there. So we do acknowledge that these conversations can be tricky, and the Beat website has some really helpful information about that. It's also helpful to let your child know where they can go for support. So GPs, the school nurse, it might be the school pastoral support team, it might be the Beat helpline on the Beat website. And of course, you can contact your GP to discuss your concerns that you might have noticed, and they can monitor your child's physical health and they can make a referral to a specialist eating disorder team if that is required. So, just as we finish today, we're just going to share some resources, which of course you'll have access to these. So, as we said, there's Beat. There's also Young Minds is a really helpful website. And there's that NHS website at the bottom that we shared with you. What help is available in Suffolk? So local support, it might be school staff, it might be school nurses. COOF is an online counselling service offering support for 11 to 25-year-olds in Suffolk, and this is completely free. It might be the GP making referrals to eating disorders team or the new ARFID specialist team, which will be coming in early 2025. We've put a link there to that website for more information on the ARFID service. The Emotional Wellbeing Hub and Feel Good Suffolk as well. So you can click on all of these links to have a look. I won't go through them in detail now due to time. We also offer more workshops if you're interested. You'll be able to scan the QR code or click the link. We've included the anxiety workshop there. And we also have some neurodiversity workshops on understanding and supporting eating and other recorded workshops you might find helpful to watch. We also wanted to share with you the Recovery College, which is part of Norfolk and Suffolk NHS Trust, and it provides free educational courses. And they also have the Discovery College as well, which offers courses for 16 to 25-year-olds as well. So those with older children, they may be interested in taking part in those. We also just wanted to share some key resources if you're worried about your young person. So there's the Young Minds Parent Helpline and web chat service, as well as additional information on their website. If a young person needs help in the moment because they're really struggling, they can speak to someone on NHS 111 option 2. Papyrus is a resource supporting the prevention of suicide for young people, and they have a 24/7 hopeline for anyone concerned that a young person may be considering suicide or for people under 35 having thoughts of suicide. And we also have a previous workshop run by the Psychology in Schools team on understanding self-harm in children and adolescents. So these are just some resources here you may find helpful if you're worried about your young person.